Imagine you are standing in a cave in what will one day be called Spain. The year is approximately 430,000 BC. You are not alone. There are others behind you, people you have known your entire life, and in your arms, or carried between two of you, is someone who was alive this morning. They are not alive now. And here is what you do next. You don't leave them where they fell. You don't abandon them to the open air and move on to the next problem. You carry them deliberately deep into the earth, into a shaft so narrow and so dark that reaching the bottom requires effort that serves no practical purpose whatsoever. You lower them in, and you leave them there. Archaeologists call this place Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones. In 1997, researchers found the remains of at least 28 individuals at the bottom of that shaft. No evidence of habitation, no food remains, no tools of daily life, just the dead. This is the oldest known intentional burial site on Earth, and it predates our own species by 200,000 years. Whatever drove those people to carry their dead into the darkness, it was not modern. It was not religious in any organized sense. It was not cultural programming in the way we understand culture. It was something older than all of that. And understanding what it was changes everything we think we know about grief, consciousness, and what separates us from every other animal on the planet. Let's start with what the bones actually tell us. For most of the 20th century, the academic consensus was that deliberate burial began roughly 100,000 years ago with anatomically modern humans. The assumption was that the cognitive complexity required for grief ritual, the ability to understand death as a permanent state, to assign meaning to a body, to perform an act for reasons that are entirely symbolic, was a late arrival in human evolution. Then, the evidence kept pushing the timeline back, and back, and back. Cima de los Huesos was not a burial in the modern sense, but the deliberate transport of bodies to a single location far from any living area, requiring significant effort with no survival benefit, points to something recognizable. Something that looks, from a distance of 430,000 years, like care. Then came the Neanderthals. For decades, Neanderthals were portrayed as brutish, unfeeling, cognitively simple, the version of prehistoric humans who couldn't quite make it. But the archaeological record has spent the last 30 years quietly dismantling that portrait. At Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan, a Neanderthal burial site dating to roughly 60,000 years ago, researcher Ralph Selecki found something that stopped the academic world in its tracks. Pollen samples taken from the soil around the bodies showed concentrations of flowering plants, cornflowers, groundsel, grape hyacinth, that should not have been there naturally. Selecki's interpretation: someone had placed flowers on the grave. The finding has been debated for decades. Some researchers argue the pollen arrived through natural means, carried by burrowing rodents. Others maintain the concentration pattern is too deliberate to dismiss. But what nobody disputes is what else was found at Shanidar. Among the dead was an individual who had been severely disabled for most of their adult life. One arm, amputated or atrophied, one eye likely blind, multiple healed injuries that would have made independent survival impossible. This person had been kept alive by the group for years. You do not keep a disabled individual alive through the brutal calculus of pure survival. You do it because something in you cannot leave them behind. Something that recognizes their continued existence as mattering, not for what they produce, but for what they are. That is not instinct. That is something else. Among anatomically modern humans, the evidence becomes richer and stranger. At Kafse Cave in Israel, dating to roughly 100,000 years ago, archaeologists discovered the burial of a child approximately 10 years old. In the child's arms were the antlers of a fallow deer, too large to have fallen there accidentally, deliberately placed. A child buried with antlers 100,000 years ago. Whatever that gesture meant to the people who made it, it was a gesture, a statement addressed to no one living, a communication sent into the silence of the earth with no expectation of reply. This is one of the defining behaviors of consciousness, the ability to perform a meaningful act for an audience that cannot receive it. The dead cannot see the flowers. The dead child cannot hold the antlers. But the people who placed them there understood that the act was meaningful regardless. That understanding, that meaning can exist without a receiver, is extraordinarily rare in the animal kingdom. It requires a theory of mind, a concept of symbolic value, and an awareness of death as a permanent and therefore significant transition. Your ancestors had all of this at least 100,000 years ago, possibly much longer. But here's the part that reaches deepest. When you study the burial practices of early modern humans across Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, a pattern emerges that no purely practical explanation can account for. The dead were positioned, not left in whatever posture they died, arranged, folded into fetal positions at some sites, laid out flat at others, oriented toward the east, toward the rising sun, at dozens of sites across multiple continents. Ochre, red iron pigment painted onto the bones, sometimes in quantities that suggest the entire body was covered. Red is the color of blood, the color of life. Someone, tens of thousands of years ago, looked at the pale stillness of a dead body and painted it red. The impulse behind that act is not intellectually distant from placing flowers on a grave today, or dressing a body in its finest clothes, or leaving the deceased's favorite objects beside them. We call those things customs, traditions, culture, but they are older than custom. They are older than culture in any formal sense. They appear to emerge from something that precedes all of that, something that activates the moment a social animal with sufficient cognitive complexity loses a member of its group. Grief, in its active form, grief that builds and marks and ritualizes, may be one of the oldest distinctly human behaviors we have evidence of. There is a harder question buried in all of this. What does it mean that our ancestors grieved, not just felt loss? Every social animal feels loss. Elephants return to the bones of their dead. Chimpanzees carry their deceased infants for days, sometimes weeks before they can release them. Crows hold what researchers describe as gatherings around their dead, sometimes lasting hours. The feeling of loss is ancient. It is not uniquely human. What is uniquely human is what we do with it. We build stories around it. We perform rituals that transform private grief into communal meaning. We mark the transition from living to dead with objects, with color, with position, with ceremony, because something in us cannot accept that a person simply stops and the world continues without acknowledgement. Psychologist Thomas Addig spent decades studying grief and concluded that at its core, bereavement is not primarily about the emotion of loss. It is about meaning reconstruction. The question grief forces is not simply, why did this happen? But, who am I now that this person is gone? That question requires a self-concept. It requires a narrative identity. It requires the kind of consciousness that can locate itself in time, that can understand not just that someone is gone now, but that they will be gone tomorrow and the day after and for every remaining day of your life. No other animal, as far as we can determine, carries grief that far forward. Only us. And here is what 300,000 years of mourning suggests about that. The capacity for grief at this depth is not a byproduct of consciousness. It may be one of its origins. Some evolutionary theorists have argued that the cognitive machinery required for complex grief, theory of mind, narrative identity, symbolic thought, forward projection in time, was selected for precisely because of the social bonds that made grief inevitable. The same brain structures that allow you to love someone completely enough that their death undoes you are the structures that allow you to model another person's inner life, to cooperate at the level required for civilization, to imagine futures that do not yet exist. You cannot have one without the other. The capacity for devastating grief and the capacity for complex love are the same capacity, and that capacity, the evidence suggests, was not bestowed upon us by history or religion or civilization. It was built into us, piece by piece, in the caves and the open savannas and the burial pits of the deep past, by ancestors who looked at the dead and could not look away. The next time you attend a funeral, notice what happens. Someone will say a few words, objects will be placed, there will be a ritual, religious or secular, formal or improvised, but a ritual nonetheless. Bodies will be oriented, a marker will be made. Every element of that ceremony has a version that is at least 100,000 years old. The flowers you bring, the specific way the body is positioned, the red of a carnation against a dark suit, the gathering of the group around the fact of a single absence. You are not performing a modern custom. You are running a program so old it predates language. A program installed not by culture, but by the same ancient selection pressure that built every other distinctly human thing about you. The program that says, this person mattered. The program that says, we do not simply move on. The program that has been saying exactly that, in the dark, in the earth, for longer than our species has existed.